I just had that chance to
Of course.
even look at emails.
Of course. You're welcome.
Thanks.
And I love that.
Shoshana, we're in Zoom,
I'm
so
moving.
you don't need to.
I'm-
All right, should we kick it off?
Yes.
All right, I don't know if anyone can see me. Hi, everybody, thank you for joining us for, this is one of our standard ELT meetings, but we've repurposed it as a panel conversation about centering equity through organizational change. So I'm gonna pass it over to Jennifer in a second to kick us off and welcome our panelists. A huge thank you to them for being here and to all of you also for being here. I do notice we have a new face in the room, Millicent. I wanted to say welcome and give you a chance to introduce yourself briefly.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Millicent Williams. I am the new director at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. It's my second time around the block, but I've been back here for 4 days and it feels like I never left. And that I've been here for the 4 years that I was here before. So anyway, glad to be back and looking forward to working with all of you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome.
Great.
All right, Jennifer.
So thanks, Becky. So hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Chang, she, her pronouns, and I'm a strategic projects manager with the transition team. It's good to see you all here, both in the room here as well as virtually. And this is, as Becky mentioned, the second in a series of 3 panels that we've put together. They're really designed to be informative and also help facilitate conversation between our executive leadership team and also leaders from different peer jurisdictions across the country, so we can learn about different important elements of change management and leadership. And as you heard, or several of you participated in our panel last month, we learned about the role of the city administrator, specifically different threads of commonality across jurisdictions, as well as things to be mindful of when we're building and thinking through our own organizational structure. And today we're really fortunate to have a great panel of leaders from across the country to share with us about the importance of centering equity through organizational change. Advancing equity in our work is an important core value and goal for us as City of Portland employees and leaders. And organizational change is a very exciting time in which we can think differently about how we provide services to communities and also how we build culture to be positive and equitable in our programs, in our bureaus, and also in our organization. And it can also be create a space for innovation, creativity, and growth. At the same time, it can also be a time of where there's a lot of stress and it can be complex and hard. And often people may feel fear or anxiety or also lack the ability to plan for the future. So just kind of thinking about that kind of those balance of different places that we experience through change, it's critical that as leaders in doing part of organizational change, it's critical to bring along people in our organization to help ensure that they're supported, that they feel heard and are heard, and also engaged in the process. When we lead through change, it's a really unique honor, and it's also a time, oftentimes we have to do so through environments where we have very real constraints on our time, resources, and also capacity. And so to make advances in equity, we have to actually have an intentional focus on it at the very beginning of the process and also throughout. Otherwise, oftentimes, equitable goals and outcomes can easily fall to the wayside amidst all the other competing demands. So that's really the focus of our panel discussion today, is like, how do we ensure that we're centering equity and equitable practices from the beginning? And so each of our panelists have a unique story and experiences in terms of how they have and continue to center equity in their work. And before I turn it over to the panel and our moderator, just would like to cover a few logistics. First of all, we are recording this presentation, and we'll record it up through the question and answer section. So please hold your questions or comments until we finish hearing from our panelists. And then when we get to the question and answer part of the session, use your raise hand feature in Zoom. If you're with us virtually or in the room, please just raise your hand so that we can know who has got comment and then be able to reach everyone. And then we will be saving a recording of this on our website, so it's available for folks who weren't able to participate, or also for our employees as well who are interested. And at this time, I'd like to pass it to Jeff Selby, our Interim Director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and to our panel. And if you could share your name and pronouns, if you're comfortable, your current role and the form of government that you work. And then also, if you'd like to share a word or phrase that you would use to describe the nature of advancing equity work through organizational change. So pass it to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Selby, he, him pronouns. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm the Interim Director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. I've been with the office for 10 of its 11 years and have played various roles in the Bureau, from training manager, communications manager, deputy director, and I'm frequently the interim director. One word I would use to describe the nature of advancing equity through change would be institutionalizing equity in government is non-negotiable. Let's find out what our panelists have to say. Amanda Jasso, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Amanda Jasso. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Interim Equity Officer for the City of Austin, Texas's Equity Office. We were established in 2016, and I joined the office in 2018. And we are a council mayor form of government, and I report to a city manager. And so, yeah, and my word, also cheating, 2 words, I'm going to use radical hope.
Very cool. And it's word or phrase for the record, so you're doing just fine. Up next, Mayor Jake Spano.
Good morning, everybody. It's good afternoon here, but still a little bit of good morning there for you. Jake Spano. I am the mayor of St. Louis Park, Minnesota. I use he, him pronouns. And I am been the mayor in St. Louis Park for 8 years and spent 4 years as a at-large council member on the council. So we have both boards and at-large members of the council, and then me. There's 7 of us. So 4 years as council, 8 as mayor, and I work in a council manager form of government. So we work through our city manager to achieve our goals, and I'll stick with a word. I would say invigorating.
All right, thank you, Mayor. And Joanne Pierce.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Joanne Pierce. I have she, her pronouns. I use she, her pronouns. I currently work for Durham County government in North Carolina. I've had 3 positions over the past 9 years working for county government. I served as deputy health director, interim health director for the county, and also currently serve as assistant county manager for about 3 years. A form of government is we have 5 elected commissioners, and I do my work through a county manager that's appointed by the commissioners. And if there is a quote I'd like to use, it would be simply nothing changes if nothing changes.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's really an honor to be your moderator today. You're in for a real engaging, informative conversation with these distinguished panelists. And thanks to Jennifer and the transition team for being very intentional about equity and for organizing the panel today. I just want to set the table real quick for the conversation by reminding us that 11 years ago, the city of Portland responded to demands from communities of color that the city get its house in order in terms of equity. And that response was the creation. I'm hearing a lot of external noise. Is there a way that we can, I don't know.
No, because unfortunately, if I mute the room, it mutes you, we can't hear you, so there's not.
Well, that may not be a bad thing. Okay, we'll continue. Okay, sorry about that. But so the communities of color.
Because if I do this, then we can't hear them at all.
Yeah, you can't hear me at all.
It's either audio on and they hear us, or audio off and we can't.
What about that mute right there?
What? Whoa.
Yeah, that mute button.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. Oh, that works. Very cool. So the response to communities of color saying that the city needs to get its house in order. The response was the creation of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. And it was a promise that the city made to community that we would do better. And since then, we've institutionalized equity in many facets of our government, keeping in mind that 11 years is not a whole lot of time to effectively address hundreds of years of institutional oppression and systemic exclusion. But for this historic government transition that we're all a part of, we have the amazing opportunity to further this equity work, make it more robust, and give equity leaders and practitioners more autonomy and authority to move the work forward. I've recently heard equity described as a program. That was pretty recent, but it's not a program. It's how we do everything at the city. It's so important. And it's the city core value, and we really must uphold our promise to community. So this panel discussion today will help us all decide how to better institutionalize equity in this transition process, but also set it up for success for the new form of government. And so with that, I will, let's dive into this conversation. So my first question for the panel is if you could share an organizational or systems change that you've been a part of, what was the change, and then what was your role? So that's the first question. Amanda, could we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank y'all. So I will say we are a 10-1, so 10 council members and the mayor sit on our dais. And that change shifted in 2014. Prior to that, we had a gentleman's agreement where there was kind of an understanding that there would be an elected Latino representative and an elected Black representative on council. And so having these district representatives as council members, and that shift in 2014, it was a win for community. Community was really supportive and happy about this. So I just wanted to say that. And then we are currently going through a very interesting shift here in Austin. We were created in 2016. Sounds very similar to Portland in terms of it was community demand that was demanding this really. And these were directly impacted community members who were suffering and seeing the outcomes in their communities due to city policy practices, procedures. And so it wasn't, out of the benevolence of our city government that the office was created. But we were created as an autonomous entity then. We are now in kind of going through a restructuring of our organization. We have a interim city manager and a mayor who was elected just this past November and is really pushing an agenda that is very similar to what it was like when they were previously serving in Austin in the 90s. So they're back. Our current mayor was a senator and is a very powerful lawyer, has a lot of political sway. Our interim city manager is really taking his job very seriously and is making a lot of changes as an interim and has been here for about 6 months. And so we are actually in the midst right now in budget season as part of our draft proposed budget. We have been consolidated into a new department called Civic and Business Equity. And that would be with our small minority business resources department, as well as our civil rights office. And we have a lot of concerns about this. Directly impacted community members are very concerned about this. As you know, as Jeff kind of introed the office, our autonomy and authority is being challenged in this space. We are, kind of in charge of all equity efforts across the city and developing capacity across the city to work on this. We are not a program or a division as we are being described in the proposed city budget. So I'll say with reorgs, there's the potential for change, and in this case, I don't think change for the better in terms of equity is really happening. So I'll leave it there unless you all want me to speak more on that.
Well, we will definitely dive in a little bit deeper on that. We'll stay with the first question for Mayor Spano. If you can share an organization or a system change that you've been a part of, and what was the change and what was your role?
Well, specific to this issue, first, thank you for the question, Jeff. Specific to this issue, right? So, when I became mayor is when we launched our race equity work, and we really didn't know what that meant or where that would lead. This, unlike Austin and maybe Portland, there was not a large demand from our community to be digging into this work. However, I think some of us on the council maybe felt that we were missing things, or there were things that were going on that we just didn't know about. We knew enough to know that we didn't know. And this was a personal issue of interest for us, for some of us. And so we started our work maybe 7 years ago, I want to say. And my role in that as the mayor really was to try and normalize that conversation as sort of the picture of what kind of a lot of folks would imagine a sort of position of power looks like, right? Sort of white, middle class, cisgender, right? Suburban mayor. I think that was probably one of my early on, at least one of my most important roles, was just to be talking about it in a way that maybe made it not appear to be quite so edgy or threatening, right? So I think for a lot of people, because my community, and to be clear, like I get very little pushback from my community on this work, but our community is 80 to 85% white. And so for them, a lot of this was, well, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means when you talk about this. Like, what does it mean in terms of city operations? Why is the city involved in this? That feels like a social, so just lots of questions more than resistance. So that was my role.
Fantastic. That's fascinating. I've got a follow-up question for that, but we'll cover that as we move along in the conversation. But and I think it would be beneficial for everybody as a little bit later to know the significance of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, where it's located, and some of the relevant history there as well. But let's go to Joanne. And Joanne, that first question, could you share your experience with systems or organizational change in your role?
Sure. The thing that comes to mind, which was really a very significant enterprise-wide shift we experienced for Durham County government. We were working on our strategic plan, revitalizing it, renewing it, refreshing it about 5 years ago. And our county manager at the time thought it was really a good idea to use the Managing for Results framework, which to incorporate that, which of course is a planning and management tool that really can help you drill down and get close to your monitoring and evaluation. And so that was for all 26 departments, really just kind of looking at our data and asking questions. What are we doing? How do we know that we're being effective? You know, look at and examining at a deep level, what program services, interventions that you implement, are they required by any federal or state or some requirement, or are these things that we feel good about doing, and what is the return on investment? Well, needless to say, that was, I guess it was, I'll be very transparent, you know, people were fearful, like, what is this? You know, what does that mean, potentially could mean for my program, my area? And some actually, you know, we inherit things and they didn't know, you know, why. We were asking the questions why, which of course we know is using a root cause analysis. Like, why are you doing what you do? What are you doing? And are we leading with data? And are we changing the material conditions of the people's lives that we serve? And so it took about a year to really get it going. And we had to do a lot of pre-work because this was going to be a tremendous organizational shift. It meant that we needed champions across the county enterprise to, you know, move this forward. We had, you know, some consultants come in who were really strong on obviously strategic planning and also using this framework so that our data, you know, we collect data, but we needed it to make sense and make meaning and really shift and really, because we make great investments into these programs and services, but were we really doing the work? And so this was a great opportunity to embed equity into this whole process. And one of the things I failed to mention is that when I was in public health, I started working to really, from my previous work, really be intentional and ask us all, our enterprise, to be intentional about advancing equity in our work and looking at it using tools that could really ask those questions that as we're just going on our way, doing our work, that we really needed to ask some questions that we could skip because, you know, our minds are meaning making machines and we're trained to do what we do and we don't pause to ask those questions. And so through this process, again, we did pre-work, we did booster work, we identified champions who would move it forward. And we even addressed the concerns and quite frankly, fears of folks, you know, just asking, you know, is my work going to be sunsetted? What is going to happen? And we said, well, look, let's lead with data. Let's do the hard work, the heavy lift of understanding what we're doing. And some of the things that we learned, and I'm sorry I'm jumping and I don't mean to, but some of the things that we learned was that we really didn't share operational definitions about just some basic things that we needed to know, like even from measurements to what we do, how we do it, and certainly we need to share language around equity and what did we mean. And so we started there and moved forward. We created our strategic plan, and certainly equity was one of those core components. And we knew that we needed to embed it. And then that of course created an opportunity for me to request an office on equity, which we do have now.
Fantastic. And that's fine. You know, jumping the gun is fine on the next question because you set us up for the next part, right? So the next question is, what did you learn as a result of that change, just as Joanne shared? And in hindsight, would you have done anything differently? So Amanda, in your case, I guess, what are you learning about all this right now, and what would you do differently?
Yeah, it's such a good question. You know, something I think this is like our inside outside strategy and practice that's happening right now. We've always kind of taken that approach, like we know we can't be effective on our own within the city, and change always ends up coming from the outside, really. And so we're seeing that happen, the push for change the pressure for change has to come from community, and we're seeing that happen right now. What I'm learning is that I maybe should have taken a different strategy internally with our new leadership. I think because we knew that it was unclear, I think, how supportive our new leadership was going to be of our office and the work we were doing. So I think we took the strategy, well, I know we took the strategy of kind of laying low and kind of seeing how things would play out, in hopes that if we kind of laid low, stuck to our work, as you know, as we always do, and kind of let that happen, that the clock would kind of run out on some of our leadership's time in the city. And I think I maybe would have rethought that and taken more proactive approaches of just sitting down with them early on. Whether or not they would support us and maybe have put a magnifying glass on us earlier, that's a possibility, but I think I wish I would have considered that more, and kind of gotten community, or not gotten them, but we have our community leaders who I think could have started applying pressure earlier, and I don't think we alerted them to any of this early enough. I mean, it was a shock to us, but I also think the possibility of it should have been closer to our minds and hearts. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I'm at. And I think having champions on council early on is something that we've really needed. And there is just a lot of turnover, and we have a fairly young council right now in terms of experience on the dais, and have a lot of political aspirations. So I think doing sort of a power analysis of where people are and what their goals are is really helpful, because I think knowing where we can kind of move certain folks is really necessary in terms of the longevity of our office. Because I think let's be real, like I think there has been an expiration date on a lot of the work that we've been doing, and I think that's always a possibility, because it's work that wants to create change in very large systems that are very resistant to change in terms of racial equity. And so I think we're just in a period where the rubber band is snapping back, and having to regroup and re-strategize needs to always be a part of our work plan. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The pendulum swing, you know, I've seen a lot of societal changes in the past 10 years of doing this work. And, you know, data is showing that, for example, white support for Black lives is less now than it was before the murder of George Floyd. And this work that we're doing is under attack more so than any other time in recent history. It's being weaponized against the movement, and we're seeing a lot of that. One of our tools and resources that have become pretty popular in the city is an inclusive writing guide, and that was featured on Fox News recently. And the amount of vitriol that this office and the 311 callers are getting is horrifying. So the work is under a lot more scrutiny and attack even than in recent memory. Mayor Spano, what did you learn from your experiences in systems change, and what do you think you would have done differently, if anything?
Well, the number one thing I think that has become a real sort of thread through all of my work, and really in all of my life, is really kind of coming out of COVID, is about providing grace for yourself and each other. So I don't know that I necessarily had that perspective effective early on, but I certainly would say that the last couple of years, my ability to, or my desire for and my capacity to give forgiveness and grace and understanding has definitely expanded. And so I think that, so I provide that as just a little bit of context. Like, I try not to do too much like Monday morning quarterbacking. However, yes, learning from your experiences, I think, is really, really important. So what I would say is maybe two broad things. Number one, culture eats policy for lunch. And we made an intentional decision as a city to focus internally within the city organization on equity before we started engaging our neighbors and community, right? And that was because I did not want one of our, I should say, public works staff to be cutting the grass in a park and have a resident say, like, hey, I heard about this thing the city's involved in with race equity, and I don't really what is that? What's going on with that? And I thought it would be a real disservice to our team to not, number one, to not prepare them for that conversation, right? And number one. Number two, we wanted and needed our team at the city to be on board with that and be engaged in that work and to help to sort of shape and frame that work and understand why it was important. So I think making the decision, and I heard Amanda talk about this earlier, right, about, is it more internal facing? Is it more external facing? Like, every organization has to do that calculus on their own. But I would say that you can come up with lots of rules and lots of policies, and you can actually have the net negative impact of what you're trying to do if you don't have people's sort of hearts in it, right? So there's lots of different strategies and tools that people use and what have you. I'll give you an example. That one of the things that I used and found is that as I was talking to white folks about this, I from time to time would get questions about, like, why is the city doing this? That feels like it's not really a city thing. That feels like it's a social service program or something. And I would say, well, it turns out cities have always been in the business of race. And I would share with my community, I've done some webinars on this, that St. Louis Park was one of the most egregious users of restrictive racial covenants on residential properties in the Twin Cities. In fact, my entire neighborhood, including my house, was subject to a restrictive racial covenant. And I found this out through a project called Mapping Prejudice, which is at the University of Minnesota. It's going through property deeds and looking for this language and mapping those properties. And what I found out very quickly, I would be honest with you, I was a little shocked at how interested largely my white neighbors were in this fact that their house might have that, because they, of course, were like, I would never support, I wouldn't do that. I don't do that. I don't, right? And so walking them through and helping them to understand how restrictive racial covenants were used in my community and potentially in their home, but that it was part of a broader strategy that was happening, right, from, 1920 to 1950, right? And when you explain to white folks that the high water mark for Black home ownership in America was 1910, it's been going down ever since, right? Like, suddenly when it's about their home, suddenly it becomes very real to them, right? They sort of understand it maybe in a little different way. So that's one way, sort of, as I was dealing with folks externally. I also think, like, spending time listening, number one, right? It's really about listening to your team, letting folks talk about their experiences as they've been subjected to racism, but also to listen to your white employees and team members who have questions and don't understand. And we frequently talk about sort of all of this works on a continuum, and everybody's kind of in a different space. And I've always felt my job in this work was to find somebody where they were and try and move them a little bit further along the line as I'm moving further along the line in my work. So I think that the whole issue of freeing up people's hearts. It sort of opens them up to being a little bit more receptive to the rules and then the data and all of the rest of it, right? So finding a way to kind of speak to that, I think, is one of the things that I learned. I wish I'd known or found something sooner that sort of opened up that aspect of the discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mayor. The team lets me facilitate our racial equity 101 trainings still every once in a while. I did one this morning actually before this, but speaking of the language that was used, the Oregon Constitution, for instance, had a lot of racist language in it, and 28% of the voters of Oregon voted against removing that language from the Constitution. And we talk about the covenants on properties here, where it says it's illegal to sell this property to a Black person or an Asian, but not using the terms Black person or Asian. I can remember, like I'm an Army veteran, and there was a former Marine in one of my Equity 101 classes who said, "Come on, this is all just words, can't you just get over it?" And I said, "Well, that's interesting coming from a soldier." And he said, "I'm not a soldier. Soldiers are in the Army. I'm a Marine." And so I said, "So words matter when they matter to you." And I love how you were talking about how the community members, the white community members, were thinking about this. And this is connected to their home. This language, these covenants, this is a part of where they live, and they're taking responsibility for that. I don't know if I've encountered a lot of that in our work in Portland, but that is an interesting thing. And also knowing that if you didn't have demand from community to do this work, how did you know what to do? How did you know what work you needed to do if it wasn't a demand from community?
Well, I mean, I think we saw what was going on in other places, right? We weren't immune to that. We saw Ferguson, and we saw a lot of those issues. I'll tell you, so from a personal perspective, a brief personal story, right, is I worked for the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. His name is Chris Coleman. Chris, I was the marketing director for the city. And it's really where, by the way, for all of you, like I used to work for a US Senator. I was the Deputy Secretary of State here in Minnesota. I've had some great opportunities, but working for the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota was where I really saw where real power resides in service. And it's really at the local level. So you all have a great opportunity, obligation, and responsibility. And when I was in Chris's office, Chris launched his race equity work. And we did the Courageous Conversations sort of retreat with all of the department directors and his mayor's office staff. And our deputy mayor at the time is a Black man, and his name is Paul Williams. And I kind of had a little bit of a crush on Paul because he's just one of the smartest, most thoughtful, most strategic people I know. And when we were sort of lining ourselves up on the wall, sort of profiled based on our own racial identity, our own view of our own race, when I saw Paul, sort of across the room in this space of folks who really saw their own race very, very negatively, it was a moment for me where I actually looked at him and I was like, no, like you're on the wrong side. You're supposed to be over here with me. Like you're the smartest person in town. That was the moment, right, for me personally, where I started to see like there's stuff I don't know. And I think we just tried to make that argument to our residents, like, hey, as you dig into this stuff, you start to find out, for example, when we do our visioning process and we disaggregate our data based on race, and we find out that 85% of the people who live in this city love living in St. Louis Park. And 43% of our Black and brown neighbors use words like sad, lonely, and isolated to describe their experience living in my city. And when you hear that, you can't not hear it, right? Like, if 43% of our business community was talking about the way we assess roads, or 43% of our neighbors were talking about the way we plow the roads, we'd be talking about that, right? So and I think that the communities began to see that, and they began to see it in other places. And there was a genuine desire in my community to be better. They did not want to have happen in St. Louis Park what was happening in some other places. And they were genuinely committed to wanting to be better. And so I don't think it took a whole lot for my community to be interested in it. I think the biggest, by the way, the last thing I'll say then, I think the biggest challenge that I had was actually sort of white allies. That was kind of the biggest challenge for me, right? Was people
tell us more about that.
Well, the amount of sometimes performative work that people think they're doing, and their heart's in the right place, right? Like I want to believe that. I want to assume their heart is in the right place. But I think sometimes there is a desire, and we as a council even had this desire early on, was let's make a list. Let's tick off all the boxes. We got to get through all this. There's a lot to do, and we got to do it. And let's go fast. And it was really Alicia Sojourner, who was our first race equity manager, who actually is the race equity manager in Vancouver, Washington now. They were the first ones to really help us understand we needed to slow down and go deep, and this was going to be hard. So I think that white, the desire of white allies to help, again, rooted in a good place, but sometimes it manifested itself in ways that wasn't exactly helpful, right? And ultimately, sometimes the result of what they wanted might have a disproportionately negative impact on Black and brown folks, but they didn't have to live with that. And they didn't understand that. And so they didn't understand why we weren't doing it. But when we talked to Black and brown folks in our community about it, they were like, the sanctuary cities is a great example. We reached out to our, especially our Mexican American, our Latin American community, and said, like, do you want us to do, like, and they were like, nope, we're good. Your police department operates like a sanctuary. We do not need you drawing any attention to us. So please don't do that, right? But we caught a little bit of flack for not doing that, even though, the folks that were most impacted by it, that was their request. So stuff like that.
Yeah, who knew that, you put it a lot more eloquently than I usually do, but who knew that white progressives would be such a barrier to racial equity work? But it is a fact in many places, certainly. So Joanne, with Amanda and Mayor Spano's responses, and you gave us a little bit of a taste of that when you answered the question, and what did you learn? Is there anything else you want to add to that? To the second question of what did you learn, and would you do anything differently?
Yes, just a few points. Ditto to what Amanda and Jake mentioned. I'm reminded after Jake has spoken of Neely Fuller's quote, and I am paraphrasing. He said that, when we don't understand racial inequity, systemic oppression, everything that we do around that to solve for those issues will only confuse us. And so that just also is a good segue into a real example that currently is happening with a local jurisdiction nearby to us, won't name it. But we were on the same track for advocating internally for an office on equity. And because I sit in the county manager's office, I have the breadth of the enterprise, all the departments. And so when it's time to do the work, it really can have an institutional impact. And the other individual who was leading the work for another jurisdiction, they were going very quickly, and we know this work requires that intention and strategy, and doing both and internally and externally. So you have that community, you've built the constituency from the community to say, this is what we demand, this is what we need. And then internally you have those folks, even some elected champions to push for us. And so that other jurisdiction actually housed this work and office in a procurement department or division, which of course doesn't allow the breadth of the work to occur without going through many different I guess it just creates barriers. And so one thing I've learned, and I even share when I speak with others, if you're even thinking about, this work, it has to be, and it is the best practice, has to be at the highest level of government. It has to sit there so that there is this opportunity to bring forth the change that we all want and need, and just making sure that we make a strong case why.
Great. And you've kind of, once again, set us up for the next question. Joanne, you're a better moderator than I am at this point. How would you recommend ensuring equity is elevated in a government transition process, what we're going through in Portland right now? Amanda.
Yeah, I think kind of following up on what Joanne said, I think what we're having to do now is kind of show how, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, GARE, has, outlined how it is a national best practice to have an autonomous office who has direct access to city manager, city administrator, however y'all are going to be set up, because getting kind of buried in the bureaucracy, it's where innovation and creativity will go to die, and we won't be able to be nimble. I mean, we have examples of how we've needed that city manager access. For instance, during our we've had climate related disasters here, and we weren't initially involved in the recovery efforts. We weren't brought into those conversations. And so we went to the city manager and we're like, hey, why aren't we here? We need to be, yes, we have relationships with directly impacted community members and we're doing what we can, but we need to have access to our, Homeland Security emergency operations staff. And we were immediately added. And so we were able to kind of have that access that we really needed to get resources to the folks where we knew they weren't being served. And so I think, these layers, the layers of bureaucracy, if the office is not elevated in a way where you're demonstrating that racial equity is a priority, it means a lot to community, and you will see like just how ineffective an office can be. And I'm learning also in these reorgs, bearing an office and its work like this, I think gives an opportunity for a seemingly progressive city like Austin to phase out the work without saying, hey, we're defunding this priority. That even though they're still saying they know the language, they're still saying equity is a priority, yet in the reorg, they're kind of moving it into this way that isn't elevating, that's diminishing the work in actuality. And so I think kind of paying attention to who your champions are going to be on council is really important. Who will not have a problem kind of going toe to toe with the mayor and or the city administrator, I think is really, really important and helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Earlier in another question, you had mentioned the inside-outside strategy, and I know the panel knows what that is, and I certainly know what it is, and equity practitioners understand that. But could, just for everybody to be on the same sheet, could you kind of explain what inside-outside strategy is?
Yeah, it's really, we have to lean on our relationships with directly impacted community members to really make any change in the city. Our city managers want to look good, and when there's media and 500 people signed up for public comment at a city council meeting to kind of read them on the dais, they don't like that. And so I think being able to look at organizing principles, we have a city contract with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and we really look at their principles and their approach to organizing to get things to happen. And so, yes, we have good relationships within the city, but we really need our community members to kind of bring the heat. And so, yeah, our inside outside strategy is that's what I'm referring to in that way.
Great, thank you. Mayor Spano, how would you recommend ensuring equity is elevated in a government transition process?
Well, first off, I always think it's fascinating, and I'm sort of picking through Amanda's words, and I'm not picking on Amanda, but picking through her, whereas she sort of talks about like somebody who will take on the mayor, and I do think that, or bring, community members to bring the heat, right? And I think that there's a balance there, right? There has to be a balance there. Any system that is not in balance will not succeed. And so, yes, there needs to be rightful pressure brought when it needs to be brought. And there also needs to be elevation and appreciation, right? There needs to be recognition, right? And so I tell people lots of times, like, it's like the sort of song says, right? There's a time for everything, right? And if you don't give your communities times to push or times to rest, right, they will sort of max out on you, and they will burn out, right? So I think it's taking this long view, right, and seeing it as a team effort, not sort of, and I realize I speaking from sort of a fairly homogenous, fairly calm, knock on wood, middle class suburban community in Minnesota. So it might be, it's different than it is in other cities, but we border Minneapolis, and so we're not immune to the conversation and some of the impacts of things that happen in bigger cities. But I think it is really about trying to approach this as a team. Everybody's got a role to play in it, right? So I want to kind of plus one to a lot of the things that were said before, right? About mapping the ecosystem, right? Know where the power resides in your organization and in your community. I would say also, like, remember that you're going to have people who are powerful. You're going to have people who influence them. You need to know kind of what speaks to them. But this is a both grass tops and grassroots type of thing. Like, I think about this in terms of like a campaign, right? This isn't just leaders that are driving this, and you've got this, position and department, which I believe in, by the way. I think it should be a standalone department, elevated. And that was one of the big important things that we did, was to make the position in the office equal in standing to public works and to parks and recreation and everything. Give it a budget, give it staff, right? Grow it, and that that happened over time. But it's also about embedding it in departments, right? So putting it into people's position description, so it's part of their job description, is to be focused on issues of equity. And so it needs to be both of those, I think. And then the last thing I would say, which I know Portland has done, but for a lot of cities, they have not, which is to explicitly make it one of your strategic priorities, right? So for St. Louis Park, we have 5, and being a leader in race equity is one of our 5 strategic priorities. And I believe, and we believe, that it's a sort of competitive advantage that we have over cities around us. And when all of the unrest around George Floyd's murder took place, I was really proud of the fact that our police department said publicly he was murdered. Like, they named that, right? And that didn't happen because we just came to this work now. It was because we've done a lot of work as an organization for a number of years. And then that's, as long as I mentioned policing, that's the other thing that I just do want to sort of note, is that I have tried to really deliberately, and we as a city have really tried deliberately to say, this is not a policing issue. If you think somehow that race equity is going to fix, assuming there's something to be fixed with a police department, right? But fix your issues in police, it's so much bigger than that, right? But I also think it's a bit of a red herring, right? It sort of allows you to focus on, oh, this is a community safety policing issue. It's not really about parks and recreation. It's not really about all these other things. And I use the example that we have, and I really push hard for us to abandon special assessments. I believe that special assessments are a systemic racist part of city government. It focuses your resources where people have the finances to pay for those resources, right? And so thinking about it as a much broader effort than just sort of what captures news or captures people's attention in the news, I think is important as well. So.
Yeah, Mayor, real quick, could you tell us the connection between George Floyd and your city and how that may have how that influenced your work in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, right? But George Floyd was a resident of our city when he was murdered in Minneapolis, and that was and I did not know him, and I did not know that he was a resident in our city. It's 50,000 people in the city until sometime after the fact. But his family has been in our city for our sort of annual events that we have to honor him and focus on him and his family. But yeah, so he lived about a half a mile from my house, and so I got a lot of phone calls from a lot of people in that time from around the country who I've worked with, other mayors and council members, sort of asking about how things were going, and it was certainly a really, really painful and difficult period for our community and for people around the world. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest. We always talk about how this time when something bad happens, it's going to be different next time, and it never really, we always seem to find other situations that come up and pop up. But I do think that for us as a community, it's been a little closer home that way.
Yeah, I appreciate you answering that. It's difficult all around, I know. Joanne, give us the secrets. How would you recommend ensuring equity is elevated in a government transition?
I will just say I'm enjoying this conversation because it's just reminded me, and I didn't mention that in my introduction, I had the pleasure of serving as the executive director for the State Office of Minority Health for North Carolina, and the director of the State Office of Minority Health for Texas. And just without, I would just say one of the recommendations is that we really just need to be critical lovers of our systems and institutions. So, we can love our system and institutions enough that, of course, we can applaud and be proud of the work that we do that really advances our efforts to ensure that the folks that we serve are truly being served, and then love our systems enough that we get more proximate to our data to determine and examine our data to determine where we need to put more effort to address the inequities that are so deeply embedded in our systems and institutions. And so that's, I'm leaning into what Amanda and Jake said, about just strategy. So I think that's one, a few things. And the truth be told, if we look at what we do, how we do it, and where we allocate our funds, we use a lot of our funds, and I can speak for, I guess, my institution, for inequities. And we're just chasing it. We're adding more money, pour more into programs and services, because we do know that programs, services, and interventions alone are wholly inadequate to address systemic issues. And so, these are the secrets and we know the answers. It's just, do we have the will to do what needs to be done to really create equity so that everyone has an opportunity to achieve their best outcomes in our systems and institutions. So I would just say that, and really lead with data, and not just, looking at the data, but examining it and asking those questions, who's benefiting, who's not, who's having the worst outcomes, why? and ask questions why more, because if we just use that top level why, thus the programs and services we have that really don't delve very deeply into what we need to address.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joanne. What a really engaging conversation. I really appreciate that. And now it's time to put you on the hot seats for just open questions. Jennifer, how do you want to do that? I know you have a process set up. I just forgot it apparently.
But
We guys should stop the recording, first of all.
yes, hold on.